Ladies and gentlemen, in that case, let me give everyone a very warm welcome to the ceremonial pre-premiere of the book polls, which I have just written, and I suggest we begin our meeting in a way that somewhat captures the atmosphere of the episodes on the Real History YouTube channel. Piotr Zychowicz, Real History, is happening before our eyes. Exactly. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, today during this meeting, we will tie history, tragic history, together with the present because, as you know, we have a huge, gigantic row or dispute on the Kyiv-Warsaw line. It is, of course, about President Zelensky giving one of the Ukrainian units, specifically the Independent Northern Special Operations Center, the name or designation of the heroes of the UPA. And of course, this simply caused such a gigantic explosion of outrage in Poland. I have the impression that this was the final straw that made the cup of bitterness overflow. And ladies and gentlemen, we are now dealing with, well, to put it mildly, a crisis in bilateral relations. As you know, I have now written the book Polls, Politically Incorrect Stories, Volume 7, but the previous volume, the 6th, was Ukrainians. And so, of course, these two matters overlap. And today I would like to devote our meeting to this history. Let us start with the present. You more or less know the course of events. From left to right, everyone in Poland, politicians, but not only them, internet users too, is of course outraged, and rightly so, that the executioners of Poles being glorified in this way. People who committed genocide against our compatriots in the territory of Volhynia and later Eastern Galicia are being commemorated in this way. A serious statement, of course, came from President Naraki, who said that he would take away, or would like to take away, Zelensky's Order of the White Eagle. On the 8th of June, the chapter will convene, and of course they will deliberate on it. Personally, I believe this is an operetta-like gesture. I do not know whether Zelensky even remembers that among the hundreds of medals he has received all over the world, he also received the Order of the White Eagle. I think it is of no use to him at all. Therefore, another lever must be found, and this must be answered symmetrically in a different way. But I will tell you about that in the last part of our meeting, when we move on to the summary. The Polish side reacted with outrage, and rightly so. Let us now think about it and look at the other side, the Ukrainian side. And here I see a whole range of all those arguments which we have already encountered many times in the past. That is, first of all, do not speak about this out loud. Do not be outraged at Zelensky, because only Russia will benefit from it. We are fighting against Russia, also in your Polish interest. Therefore, do not get uppity and do not pick on us, because this is grist to the mill of Russian propaganda. Only the problem, in my opinion, is that the fact that Ukraine is fighting for its own independence, let us stress that, in its own interest, so as not to end up under the Russian boot, cannot give it a shield and immunity to glorify and commit such affronts against, to glorify the executioners of the Polish nation and commit such affronts against us. I see no cause and effect relationship here between these two matters, and this argument seems misplaced. The second matter, and this is already very serious, and I see it even in official statements, is an attempt to show symmetry of guilt. Poles, what exactly is your problem? I mean, okay, we have our heroes. Stop with this lordly arrogance of yours. Those times are over. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when you had the Cossacks under your boot, we are now an independent, sovereign nation. We choose our own heroes, and in fact, your heroes were not any better. And for example, yesterday I retweeted an absolutely shocking post in which one Ukrainian internet user noticed that the GROM unit, GROM, the commandos, refers, listen to this, to the tradition of the home army. So in that case, why can we not name our special unit, writes this internet user, this commentator, after the heroes of the UPA? Since you have the home army, then we have the UPA. You may say that this is the voice of some ordinary internet user who does not see the difference between the home army and its actions and the Ukrainian insurgent army. But I will now quote a fragment from the Foreign Ministry spokesman's statement. This is new information from this morning. Listen. Well, now we know. only Russia, and Russia alone, benefits from historical disputes between Poland and Ukraine. We did not want to offend Poland, but remember that for us the 𝐿 is a symbol of the struggle against the Russians, against the Muscovites, and of course, the same argument all the time. And then, ladies and gentlemen, there appears this statement that one must not, note, this is a quotation, deny the tragic pages of history, including crimes against civilians committed by, note this, soldiers of Ukrainian and Polish formations during the Second World War. So you have exactly the same position of Ukrainian historical policy. That is, there is symmetry between the genocide in Volhynia, although they do not call it that, and the Polish retaliation. The murders were mutual. Do you remember what, for me, was the most humiliating moment? When President Duda, who to me somewhat symbolizes this kind of policy on its knees before Kyiv, right, was together with Zelensky, this was 2 years ago, in 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿, and signed, the Polish side signed, such a statement that we mourn all the victims of Volhynia, regardless of their nationality, so implied, right, on your side and on ours. Let us move forward. At the time, I very strongly criticized that statement, which was evidently written by the Ukrainian side, and it is exactly in this spirit that we now have this statement from the Ukrainian side at present. And today, during our meeting, I will try to tell you and prove to you why there can be no symmetry between the actions of the Home Army, which we will speak about very openly today. I am warning you straight away, this is real history, not historical policy. So today there will also be bitter words, and I will present facts that may be shocking, but that is in a moment. And now the most interesting statement was that of the mayor of Lviv, Mr. Andriy Sadovyi, who mocked 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿, saying, well, it will be interesting to see 𝐌𝐿𝐞𝐫𝐿, whether he dares to come, how he will take this order away from our soldiers. That is how he put it, and he recalled that until now, 𝐌𝐿𝐴 had been afraid even to cross the border and travel to Ukraine. And at the end, this is a quotation. He said this, in truth, we do not know what happened 50 or 100 years ago. After all, history was distorted. Well then, ladies and gentlemen, let us try today to straighten out this history. And today I will tell you how it was with this Polish-Ukrainian conflict, the culmination of which was, of course, the genocide in Volhynia. So in that case, let us begin with the fundamental matters. What exactly was it about? Or rather, with Ukrainians during the Second World War, consist of, very often people give very long, complicated answers, full of, parentheses, twists and turns, and social causes, psychological ones, historical ones. But in truth, there is no point complicating, ladies and gentlemen, simple matters. While the entire conflict between Poles and Ukrainians during the Second World War consisted of this, the Poles wanted the mixed territories after the war, that is, Eastern Galicia, Volhynia, and other territories, to be part of Poland, while Ukrainian nationalists, who dreamed of rebuilding Ukraine, or rather of building an independent Ukraine at all, wanted those territories to be included within the borders of a future Ukrainian state, which in their view was to arise after the war. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is the simplest conflict that has ever been fought by, I do not know, nations, tribes, clans, peoples, since the dawn of humanity, a conflict over territory. And in such a situation, there was no compromise. That is, any Polish politician who came out during the Second World War and said, we are giving the Ukrainians 4 voivodeships of the Second Polish Republic, with the third largest Polish city, Lviv, where around 300,000 people lived, of whom more than half were Poles, Jews made up roughly 30-something%, and Ukrainians 15. Such a politician would have been blown off the political board, and vice versa. The Ukrainians believed that since the Polish state had collapsed in 1939, and Poland's control over those territories which they considered their own, namely Eastern Galicia and Volhynia, had ended, then they saw no reason for those lands to return. As they saw it, this is their perspective. Under the Polish yoke, there could be no compromise. Because you know how conflicts are resolved, either by talking or by fighting. If there is no possibility of compromise and the sides differed so much in their approach to this matter, then it was clear that weapons would speak, and it was obvious that fighting would break out. And now, just as it happened the first time around. Let me also remind you we were talking about the ethnic composition of Lviv. So let us recall that in these territories, which we are talking about, in the disputed ones, about 5 million Ukrainians lived at the time our story concerns, that is, the Second World War. It was the core of Ukrainian nationalism, Galicia, Eastern Galicia. Historical experience indicated that bloodshed would occur. And that was obvious. Why? Because it was, I would say, already the second round, the second great Polish-Ukrainian contest. Polish-Ukrainian, the first, of course, took place in 1918. 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿 once rightly said that the situation resembled the breakup of Yugoslavia. You remember this perfectly well. Apart from the youngest of today's viewers, I remember it perfectly because I followed it at the moment when the Yugoslav state collapsed. Then, of course, the Croats, the Serbs, and all the other nations that made up that Slavic federation began creating their own nation-states on the corpse of Yugoslavia. And what did that lead to? Well, to the fact that some borders had to be drawn, borders of ethnic states, but people were mixed together, and therefore one great slaughter followed, and then the tribunals in The Hague had worked for many years to imprison people responsible for colossal war crimes. Because the worst, the bloodiest, are precisely conflicts over territories, civil conflicts between people who live next to each other. And it was no different at the moment when the great powers collapsed, the great multinational empires, in 1918. Let me remind you that the territories we are talking about lay within two great monarchies. And earlier, of course, they had been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the two nations. Consequently, both Poles and Ruthenians, because there were no Ukrainians yet then, first lived and existed under the scepter of a common king, and later under the rule of the Emperor of Russia, the Romanov Empire, the Ukrainians from Volhynia, and under the rule of the Austrian Emperor. These, in turn, were Ukrainians from Eastern Galicia. And as long as those great monarchies existed, these citizens of different nationalities somehow functioned together, although of course it was not without various bloody incidents and tragedies, such as, for example, the shooting by a Ukrainian nationalist in 1908 of the governor of Galicia, Andrzej Potocki. He entered his office, shot him, because by then everything was literally boiling. At the moment of implosion, of the collapse of the great powers, exactly what happened in Yugoslavia happened here. That is, smaller nations set about building their own nation-states. And these are now things perfectly well known from textbooks. November 1918, the Ukrainians proclaim their independence. The 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿𝐡 enter the action. The West Ukrainian People's Republic is established in these territories, which we are talking about. The Polish Republic is born, and war breaks out. This war lasts in the years 1918 to 1919. It is full of mutual war crimes, harsh Polonization on one side, harsh Ukrainization on the other side, in the territories controlled by these forces. Both sides built internment camps there for representatives of the enemy, hostile nationality. But what happens? Well, the Ukrainians lose this war completely. General Haller rides in on a white horse. The Ukrainian People's Republic ceases to exist, is destroyed by Poland, and suffers a catastrophic defeat. The territories we are talking about, and let us limit this, of course, because this also concerns the Chalm region, of course the Biestie and so on, but let us narrow this now to the most important territories. That is, Volhynia becomes a voivodeship of the Polish Republic, specifically its western part, because part of it is in the Soviet Union, of course together with Zhytomyr, while Eastern Galicia is divided into three voivodeships: the Stanislaw voivodeship, the Tarnopol voivodeship, and the Lwow voivodeship. Everywhere these are mixed territories. The largest number of Ukrainians is, of course, in Volhynia. That is, 70% Poles make up there, more or less 15%. The rest are Jews. In the territory of those other three voivodeships, the proportions are somewhat more even, but the Polish side sort of fouled a little there, because it simply added western counties to the Lwow voivodeship in order to change the population proportions somewhat. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Here we are dealing with a gigantic divergence between Ukrainians and Poles. What for us is a triumph, and these Poles rejoice. We regained independence after 123 years, white and red flags in luau. A great victory, euphoria. For Ukrainians, this is a time of black mourning. They believe that they lost their state, that West Ukrainian People's Republic ceased to exist, and their perspective is that they found themselves under Polish occupation. So what begins to happen? We enter the interwar period in a situation in which Poland in its southeastern territories has around 4 million, still then, Ukrainians, more or less, extremely hostile toward the Polish state, and conflict immediately flares up. And now let us start, let's say, with the Polish side. As for the Polish side, the set of these faults, in quotation marks, which are talked about so little, is clear, yes? First of all, of course, Eastern Galicia was supposed to receive autonomy. Poland broke its international obligations and gave no autonomy. Second, it was, of course, the pushing out of Ukrainian education, failure to keep the promise to establish a Ukrainian university in Lwow, various harassment against all these Ukrainian organizations. More or less, one can say that the Poles applied toward Ukrainians in the Second Polish Republic roughly the same policy as the Prussians toward Poles under the Prussian partition near the end of its existence. The greatest irritation was caused by land issues and religious issues. As for religious issues, this is of course the destruction of Orthodox churches in the Chalm region. Shocking scenes. Under various pretexts, old Orthodox churches were dismantled. When the faithful tried to protest, the Polish police beat these people with batons, kicked them, dispersed them. As a result, there were very huge resentments, outrage around the world. Second, the unfair, according to the Ukrainian side, division of land under agrarian reform. Poles received the best plots, Ukrainians, the worst ones. Another matter, the fifth already, was the influx of settlers. There was this idea that military settlers had to be brought there, that they would be this bulwark of Polishness. Problem is that these people very often, unfortunately, behaved there more or less like English colonizers in territories, I don't know, India or others. They simply considered themselves better than their neighbors. In Volhynia, they made up 70%, were reduced to the level of second-class citizens. So in short, the greatest career a Ukrainian could make in Volhynia was to become a postman. And even that was very rare. They had an uphill struggle in every possible matter. They could not make careers. Polish money went into Polish hands, in quotation marks. Yes? That is, the entire administrative apparatus was in the hands of Poles. And ladies and gentlemen, these are more or less the key issues. Here, without going into details now, the Volhynian voivode Henryk Józefski showed some strategic genius. He applied a different course in Volhynia in the 1941. Unfortunately, in 1938, when these nationalist moods were growing, he was recalled from there and Ozon, the Sanation camp, tightened the screws even more. Tighten the screws on the Ukrainians. So these are, as it were, the issues on the Polish side. These are the things that additionally aggravated the situation, that is, Ukrainians felt occupied, felt harassed, and simply champed at the bit for the moment when that Polish state would collapse and some new deal would begin. Now, what do Ukrainians do in this situation? Well, they do what all nations do that believe they are under occupation. That is, they set up an underground organization. They founded such an organization called the UVO, the Ukrainian Military Organization. It was an exact copy of the combat organization of the PPS, or the PAO Piłsudski's Polish military organization. Attacks on post offices, for example in Gródek-Jagiellonski, attacks on some individual Polish officials, tearing down those power lines, setting haystacks on fire. Well, you know, propaganda, of course. Such actions as are used by nations that find themselves in such a situation. And, of course, assassinations, because all the time the radicalization of these people is being wound up, which I will tell you about in a moment. The assassinations were these. In 1921, in Lwow, they shot at Piłsudski. He missed. The interesting thing is that the fellow's pseudonym was Smoke. That was his code name, because they all had pseudonyms, as in every underground organization. And there was such a paradox. They modeled themselves on Piłsudski's military organization, on the PAO, and they shot at Piłsudski. That was the first high-profile assassination attempt. As far as I remember, I think only the voivode was hit in the arm. Pilsudski was shot at, but nothing happened to him. 10 years later, they murdered MP 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿 in 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿. They simply entered his room. He was staying with the sisters there for such a treatment, I would say, or in a sanatorium, and he was reading a book in bed. They approached from close range and filled him with bullets there. They murdered a member of parliament who, mind you, listen, was the greatest friend of the Ukrainian cause in the Second Polish Republic. Why? Because for those Ukrainian radicals, of course, they fed on conflict. They did not want agreement, unlike those parties, like Undo, for example, more conciliatory Ukrainian ones. They wanted precisely a clash, conflict, aggravation, because they were counting on it being the breeding ground for a national revolution. And finally, the most spectacular and shocking attack for Poland was, of course, the assassination of the Minister of the Interior, Piotr. Here close to us, on Vauxhall Street, a Ukrainian assassin ran up to him and shot him in the back of the head with a pistol. There were, of course, more such attacks, raids on post offices and so on and so forth. The Polish side, of course, responded to this with repression. The most famous of those repressions was the so-called pacification of Galicia in 1930, which went down in history because of the so-called colored tulips. That is, Ukrainian girls were hung by their legs. Their colorful slips fell downward, and it looked like tulips. Polish soldiers broke because the cavalry had entered, the police, the Polish army. They entered villages in eastern Galicia. They broke the legs of horses and cattle with rifle butts. They poured kerosene over flour supplies. They destroyed the buildings of Prosvita. They beat up many of those Ukrainian activists there. You know, these were repressions intended to subdue or rather pacify the area. Of course, as you can imagine, it produced exactly the opposite effect from the one intended, because the people became even more, those Ukrainians, against the Polish state. They're enraged. So that is what it looked like within the Ukrainian underground movement. This movement undergoes a process of radicalization in two directions. First, in its methods, that is, they increasingly reach for methods of terrorism against the Polish state, for which there is no justification, let that be clear. But secondly, something takes place that historians call the fascization of this movement. And over time, that military organization, when those old officers leave it, turns into the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, the 𝐌𝐿T, a very radical, fascist-leaning organization modeled on Mussolini and National Socialism. They want to bring about, in a sea of blood and in the smoke of fires, a national revolution that is supposed to lead to the creation of an independent Ukraine. For this is that later decalogue, you know, of the Ukrainian nationalist. Everything done for the cause, even if it involves crimes, immoral acts, this is a loose quotation, is justified. We reject traditional morality and so on and so forth. And finally, the third matter, from the perspective of the Polish state, is unacceptable. That is, of course, contacts with the Abwehr, because the Ukrainians, occupied in the east, I repeat, this is their perspective, by the Bolsheviks, and in the west by the Poles, are looking for an ally. And just as Poles in an analogous situation turned to France, they turned to Germany. It is a natural, in a sense, geopolitical choice of successive generations of Ukrainian politicians. Therefore, the ABER supports this 𝐌𝐿 with various interruptions because it depends precisely on Germany's policy toward Poland. That it supplies equipment, intelligence data goes the other way, and money flows too. In a word, everything there begins to boil. A large part of these young Ukrainian nationalist activists passes through Polish prisons. Bandera receives the death sentence for Piotr. Later, apparently, the PPS men interceded for him because they said that they were doing what we did when we were young, only against the Muscovites. Now, they are doing it against us, but his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, as far as I remember, or to some prison term. Bandera is imprisoned. 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐡, after all, was established among other things as a camp at 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿 for Ukrainian nationalists. And we enter, ladies and gentlemen, in this conglomerate of mutual guilt, escalating grievances, violence, terror, repression from the other side, the tragic year, 1939. And then something happens that we should never have allowed. That is, the Polish state implodes. There is a collapse of the Polish state. And up to the moment when there was a Polish state there with its army, police, administrative apparatus, well then all of it, that whole pot that was boiling and all that, that steam was coming out of that pot, could still be held somehow in check. At the moment of the collapse of the Polish state, there immediately come terrible scenes, that is, de facto, a great rebellion on those territories. Ukrainians come out enthusiastically. They tear down Polish emblems from offices. They catch individual soldiers who somewhere have become separated from their units, and they beat them, sometimes even murder them. In Stray and in a number of other localities, there are some of the first even such anti-Polish pogroms. State emblems are humiliated, flags, all of this is being ripped down, destroyed in schools, from post offices, beatings, as I said, and of course enthusiasm over the fact that that Polish oppressor has fallen. But of course all of this is being watched by Poles, who see in those Ukrainians traitors, disloyal, monstrous people, who at the moment of Poland's greatest fall, so now we are crying, yes, the situation from 1918 is reversed, they are celebrating. So additionally, this is also another boost for all that mutual hatred, a kind of stimulus. Of course you remember the scene in Smarzowski's film. He showed it brilliantly in his film. You have probably seen Volhynia, where fugitives from the Polish army witness just such a scene, where a priest orders a pit to be dug, they throw into it a Polish flag, a 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿 cap, and a crown of thorns. Let Poland, now that it is dead, never rise again, right? The Poles are in shock. But what happens? Of course, Ukrainian expectations are not fulfilled, because there is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Hitler, even though he had such an option, and that was why he maintained that Abwehrraum contact, does not create an independent Ukraine, but those territories come under Soviet occupation. So we have something like a freezing of this conflict. There are deportations, Soviet terror, but then comes the year 1941. So the Ukrainians, of course, again stake everything on the German card, the famous case of the 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿 and Roland battalions. 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿 enters Lviv alongside the Wehrmacht. On that occasion, there are terrible pogroms against Jews. And on the 30th of June, 1941, the Ukrainians present Hitler with a fait accompli, and the 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿, because remember that this is quite a complicated matter, because there are the 𝐼𝐞𝐫𝐿ites and the Banderites. We are interested in those Banderites. They proclaim the establishment of an independent Ukraine. Hitler goes mad, because as you know, after these rapid successes of the Wehrmacht, he decides that he does not intend to share his Lebensraum with Slavic subhumans. Therefore he says Neen. Bandera and Prime Minister Stetsko, that is the Prime Minister of that government, go to a concentration camp where they will sit for the next several years. That government is dispersed, and those territories that interest us, Eastern Galicia, is incorporated into the general government, while Volhynia into the Reich Commissariat Ukraine. And of course the Banderites in this situation, disappointed with the Germans, go underground. One more thing, let us also be fair. I told you about that outburst, explosion of happiness among Ukrainians because of the fall of Poland. But let us also remember that about 110,000 Ukrainians served in the Polish army during the 1939 campaign. Let us also approach that figure with humility in the sense that, well, they did not really have a choice, because it was a conscript army, yes? Well, Poles served in the Wehrmacht too, for example, 500,000, yes? What is no secret, I write extensively about this in the book. Therefore, the fact that they served and fought does not yet mean that they did so voluntarily. But let us note this fact. In many battles, indeed, those soldiers distinguished themselves. We even have the case of Shandruk, yes? Do you know the story? He later received the Virtuti Militari. He was a Ukrainian contract officer who served in the Polish army. Okay, that is all, ladies and gentlemen. And now we move on, after this historical introduction, to show you how much this mutual hostility and this dispute over those mixed territories grew. Because the whole tragedy lies in the fact that in these, because, this is not about Mazovia or the Kiev region, yes, where there is 100% sugar in sugar and 100% Poland in Poland. This is about territories where people live mixed together, very often related by blood, which later during the genocide in Volhynia will lead to enormous family tragedies when one has to choose between Poland and Ukraine. And now, The turn of 1942 and 1943 arrives. It is already clear that Germany is losing World War II. In February, there is the surrender of Paulus's army at Stalingrad. The tide is turning. The Soviet roller begins to move toward Poland, and there is the question of occupied Poland. What will happen after the war? What order will exist after the war? And the Ukrainians think to themselves, well, there will be a peace conference. The Poles are allied with the Allies. We will be left out in the cold in such a situation. Because the Poles will say, well, we are restoring after the war the pre-war borders of the Republic of Poland. And then Churchill will ask, well, okay, but basically, what is your argument for why these territories should go to you? Then the Poles will say, the only argument they can put on the table is that there are our compatriots there. Poles live there. In Lviv, Stanislaw, Tarnopol. Okay, so let us get rid of these people, and we will get rid of the problem. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the key to understanding the genocide in Volhynia. Very often, Ukrainian historians, and in my opinion this cannot be defended in light of the documentation we have, believe that the causes of the genocide in Volhynia lay in the past. That is, that the genocide in Volhynia was a kind of revenge, or rather a response from the Ukrainian side, to everything I have described to you. That is, the mistakes of the Second Polish Republic, and the bolder Ukrainian historians even present the genocide in Volhynia as a kind of retaliation for all those several hundred years of Polish colonization in quotation marks. This is fashionable, especially among French historians regarding the lands of Rus, that it was revenge for 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿, and for the Cossack issues, and for the social issues, that is, the polonization, as you know, of the Ruthenian nobility. Well, I believe that this is untrue. Well, it is hard to find justification for those mistakes of the Second Polish Republic. The policy of the Second Polish Republic was a nationalist policy toward Ukrainians, of course. All those things I told you about do not bring us, of course, or rather our ancestors of that time, any glory. But that was not the reason and cannot constitute a justification for impaling children on fence stakes, for sawing people with a saw and hacking them with axes. That is one thing. And secondly, it was not about the past. They made that decision to carry out genocide with the future in mind, so that Ukraine would be as pure as a tear. That is the mentality of those extreme chauvinists, Ukrainian nationalists. The wheat must be separated from the cockle. The cockle means those Poles who are in the way, and then we will live in our nationalist ideal, that is, in a mono-ethnic state. The Germans had already dealt with the Jews. That is clear, right? Because we are already at the turn of 1942 and 1943. The first decision to murder the Poles is made at the command level of the middle ranks. That is, that decision is made by Piotr 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐜𝐡. This is a man to whom today Ukrainians, which is simply shocking to me, put up monuments and name streets after him. For example, in the territory of Volhynia, and he, listen, dusts off such an old plan, written back in 1938 by 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐜𝐡, that it was necessary to carry out that bloody revolution to get rid of those terrible Poles from our territories under the guise of a peasant revolution. It had to be camouflaged in this way, to mobilize the mass of ordinary peasants, so that later one could say, well, it was just such a revolt of Ruthenian peasants and Ukrainian peasants against Polish lords, and it was necessary to conceal the participation of the 𝐌𝐞 in this, and now already of the newly formed, right there in Volhynia, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, because the armed arm of the 𝐌𝐞 was, of course, the UPA, forest units. Very small at first, but soon they began to grow. And so they decided to carry out a great massacre under the cover of precisely a spontaneous peasant rebellion, and they began an uprising directed against everyone. It was also an interesting strategy, by the way, that is, against the German occupation authorities, which already at that time in Volhynia were very weak, against the Soviet partisans, who were growing in strength, and finally against the Polish civilian population. Because there were very few Germans in the field, almost none at all. In that Volhynia, they sat only in the towns and guarded that key Kovel railway line, strategic for supplying the Eastern Front, So basically, they did whatever they wanted. They fought there only with the Soviet partisans and murdered Poles. The first crime on the 9th of February in the village of Parosla. The Poles were laid out, including women and children, on the floor and systematically, with axes, struck on the heads of those people. In the book by 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐜𝐡, you will find the accounts of a little boy and a little girl. They were the only ones who survived it. Then Lipniki, the 26th of March, the famous scene. It is night. Poles flee from that village. Ukrainians chase them. A shot is fired. A woman is hit in the head, goes blind, drops a bundle from her hand. Inside is a little baby. That baby is the future cosmonaut of the Polish People's Republic, Hermaszewski. Later they managed, at dawn, somehow, to find him in that snowdrift, because it was still cold, because it was March, and that child survived and later went on to have such a career. On the 23rd of April, a gigantic massacre in the village of Janowa Dolina, which was a kind of model settlement built by the Polish side. There we have everywhere several hundred victims. And finally, there comes the 11th of July, the apogee of the crime. That is, Bloody Sunday, 99 villages, including the church in 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿, which, ladies and gentlemen, is attacked. The people inside are murdered. There is the heroic defense of the church tower. This, too, was fantastically shown in the film by Smarzowski. Where did these methods come from? So now listen to how they carried it out. Where this brutalization came from, why the wounds, the injuries of those people were so terrible. First, the signal to begin the Ukrainian rebellion directed against everyone, as I told you in Volhynia, was the order for the Ukrainian auxiliary police, that is, the Ukrainische Hilfspolizei, which served within German posts in the field, and indeed these people got up one day and went into the forest in uniforms, and with weapons. And do you know what these people had done earlier in Ukraine and in Volhynia? They carried out the Holocaust. They were the same people first. As part of German auxiliary formations, they carried out the Holocaust, murdered the Jews, and then went into the forest on orders from the underground leadership of the 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿. And with exactly the same methods, they murdered Poles. It is, you know perfectly well, ladies and gentlemen, that in the field the Holocaust looked like this, as Snyder wrote, that contrary to our ideas, especially in the first phase of the Holocaust, but not only then, to a large extent, the weapon was, with which Jews were killed, a rifle bullet, not gas, and exactly in this way, those units, later, when they moved into those kurens, killed Poles. I quote, such an account by Alexander Pradun, whom I spoke with. I conducted many interviews and spoke with survivors of that massacre, who said this. He lived in Ostroki, famous Volhynian Ostroki, and he was then a small child, and together with his mother and other people, they were driven out in such a group by those OPA men. So therefore, they ran, they were beaten, kicked. Those people shouted at them. Then we understood. We stopped in a thicket. We had not the slightest doubt. We understood that the executioners had brought us here to murder us all. Mr. Alexander Pradun told me. And they listened, ordered everyone to lie down on the ground. They arranged us in a row, face down, mother, aunt, grandmother, relatives. I lay next to my mother. She hugged me tightly. Then I heard shots, the first, second, third each, next one closer and closer. Suddenly, the bang rang out right beside me. Mother convulsed. I felt a short, strong squeeze of her hand, and then suddenly her body went limp. I felt something sticky running down my face, because his mother's brain splashed over him. They thought he was dead. He was covered, listen, by red ants, which bit him terribly. Some stump was digging into his stomach, but he lay without moving, because they were finishing off the wounded. And then, when the Ukrainian nationalists, left, he got up and simply walked away from that place. I still spoke with him, I don't know, 10 years ago. That is probably when I conducted the interview. So that is more or less how it happened. Apart from those kurens that had firearms, which were still few in number despite that flight of the Ukrainian police into the countryside, they simply mobilized peasants from nearby villages, the so-called axemen, and it looked like this. First the kuren captured a Polish village, and then came waves of axemen armed with flails, pitchforks, rakes, axes, knives, flails, everything they had at hand, And of course, they finished off the Poles, searched for those people somewhere in the grain, in some shelters, in attics, and killed them. This was forced mobilization, let that be clear. But of course, interesting incentives were given from those people's perspective. That is, a traditional human trait was exploited, namely envy and greed. Those people were promised the Poles' cattle, the Poles' houses, the Poles' tools, and above all, interestingly, not by accident, the Bandera colors are red and black. Because apart from that nationalist element, there was also a very strong socialist one. They carried out land reform, that is, they divided up the land of those murdered people among those nearby local peasants. But hence, of course, when the Poles came at dawn to those burned villages, they found all those horrors. Because, ladies and gentlemen, you cannot kill a person with an axe, a saw, or whatever you have at hand in a way that is not simply terrifying and drastic. That is why this genocide was carried out using such terrible methods. And they said openly, "We will do to you what Hitler did to the Jews." So they modeled themselves on the Third Reich, because Hitler showed them, look, if you have a problem with some hostile minority community, then it is best to deal with it in a way that previously seemed simply unthinkable when it comes to what happened well. Then later, after these murders had had their effect, that is, the Poles began, at least some of the Poles, to flee from there into the territory of the general government from Volhynia then, at the level of the Provid. That central leadership, here the decision was taken by 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿, former commander of the 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐜 battalion, who today has his own postage stamps also in Ukraine, streets named after him, and monuments. He made the decision at the level of the Provid, of the 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿 fine. We will do this too in all the other disputed territories, that is, among others, in eastern Galicia, but also in the Chelm region. And so the murders in 1944 spread into eastern Galicia and claimed in total, as Polish historians estimate, around 100,000 fatal victims on the Polish side. And now we reach the fundamental issue why there is no symmetry between what they did and what the Poles did. Because, of course, the Polish retaliation is true, and Smarzowski also showed this. Among Polish nationalists and supporters of historical policy, there is this view, do not talk about it. Because it harms the Polish reason of state, we must conduct our own historical policy. That is, the PR campaign of the Polish state, in such a way that we emphasize our suffering, emphasize our heroism, and all those not very pleasant episodes sweep under the carpet. This applies to many other things too, not only to Polish-Ukrainian relations, but as I said, this is the place for real history, so we will speak about it directly. Yes, there was Polish retaliation. Of course there was. The attacked Poles also did not only defend themselves, and they defended themselves, unfortunately, because the Polish underground state showed astonishing passivity toward what was happening. I devoted an entire book to this. It is, of course, Volhynia betrayed. So they defended themselves as best they could. They organized self-defense units, asked the Germans for weapons, and joined up since the Ukrainians went into the forest. Many Poles joined the police, the German auxiliary police. These were the so-called Greens. The Germans transferred into Volhynia from the general government a Schutzmannschaft, that is, a kind of police unit, and it also pacified some villages there, but on the other hand, Ukrainian ones, but it saved Poles. As for the Polish state, when it finally pulled itself together there, it carried out retaliatory actions against Ukrainian villages. Around 2,000 people were killed then, but this has not been counted. These are only estimates in Volhynia, as part of the so-called preparation of an operational base for the actions of the 27th Home Army Division in Operation Tempest. But the most obviously drastic scenes, as far as Polish retaliation is concerned, took place in the 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐴 region, that is, in territories inhabited, territories that today belong to the Polish state. There it really was brutal. That is, units of the Home Army and the peasant battalions carried out something that went down in history as the 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐴 Revolution. Its symbol, of course, is the pacification of Sarin, where Polish detachments of the peasant battalions and the Home Army murdered 600 people, half of them women and children. It looked like this. Houses were set on fire, and people burned alive inside them, or they were dragged out of shelters and shot. 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐡 were checked. If you had a P poll, you go Ukrainian, a bullet in the head. infants, women, everything as it came in total. During that period, more or less from the 10th of March to the 2nd of April, the Poles pacified or attacked about 30 villages. There were 600 victims in Saarinen. In the three largest villages, about 1,100. There is still debate over how many victims there may have been, but generally speaking, it is believed that Polish retaliation may have taken several thousand lives, closer to 10 than to 20, to be clear, victims on the Ukrainian side. So roughly 8 times fewer than the Ukrainian genocide. And now someone may say, why are you counting here? This is human death, tragedy. This is not bookkeeping, right? Here, one side murdered, the other side murdered. There was bloodshed. So what is the issue, really? Perhaps the Ukrainian side is right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the Ukrainian side is not right when it makes, now officially, because I mentioned that statement from today's foreign ministry, when it makes here a symmetry between these events. Why? Because the decision to murder the Poles was a decision that was made at the top of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, and it was made by the Pravd and their leader, that is, 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐡. Let me remind you that Bandera was then in a camp. Yes, because there is a famous dispute over whether Bandera was responsible or not responsible. Bandera, if you want my opinion, of course, did not issue any order. Some stories that through his wife he passed a secret note saying, "Murder the Poles" from Sachsenhausen camp are fairy tales. But he bears moral responsibility for what happened, or rather, ideological, causal responsibility. He was the leader of the 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐜, and he was the chief ideologue of 𝐌𝐿NB, precisely that most aggressive, extreme organization, and he is responsible for the deeds of people who carried out his political will. And the fact that he was in a camp, in my opinion, is no mitigating circumstance at all. I am sorry to say this very brutally, but Adolf Hitler, contrary to certain ideas and fairy tales, was never in Auschwitz either. He did not personally lead people into the gas chambers, and nobody in their right mind claims that as Führer of the Third Reich, he bears no responsibility, and above all, as the ideologue and leader of the National Socialist movement, responsibility for what later, out in the field, the Führer's will, some SS thugs put into practice. So this is only a digression, but okay, therefore on the one hand we have a decision about ethnic cleansing, about committing genocide against one ethnic group living in a given territory. On the other hand, never at the level of the Home Army High Command, the Polish government, that is, at the equivalent level, were such decisions made. As for the 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐜 revolution, well, the decision was made at the level of the Zalmost Inspectorate of the Home Army. Most likely it was approved by the Lublin District Command, and that is all the officer who took it on himself, so to speak, who is responsible, you could say, for this operation, was Marian Gołębieski, a fairly well-known officer, a 𝐼𝐶, in fact, which is interesting. And it was like this: the motive was revenge, because there were many Volhynians there in general in that 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐜 Home Army, but also a naive belief that this would frighten the Ukrainians and cause them not to commit genocide against the Poles in those territories, that is, the 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐜 area, that it would not spill over here onto this side of the border between those districts. It turned out, by the way, that this calculation, of course, as always in such cases, was wrong, because violence fuels violence. The Ukrainians, in revenge for Sarin, pacified Polish villages, but that does not change the fact that when it comes to legal classification, on the one hand we have genocide, which claimed 8 or 9 times more victims, and on the other hand retaliation, which can be classified as war crimes. And there is no reason to hide that this happened. Some stories about great battles, for example. There once was such a nationalist narrative, it was the Battle of Sarin. And then, what casualties did each side suffer? The Ukrainian side, Poland, won. Yes, the Battle of Sarin, all right. So this is, ladies and gentlemen, the story. There is no, and there cannot be, symmetry between these two matters. And that is exactly why I was so outraged by today's, or rather irritated by, the foreign ministry statement and all those stories from Ukraine's foreign ministry. Of course, that we murdered, you murdered. Therefore, let us leave it alone. Let us not reopen old wounds. Let us look to the future. Russia will only benefit from this. I absolutely reject this kind of wording and narratives. There are certain matters, there are imponderables, in which, ladies and gentlemen, we must defend. And now, the punchline of this story. This happened, and this is the history which the mayor of Lviv, yesterday in an interview, said nobody knows what happened. Well, we do know what happened, because I have just told you. And now, among part of the Polish elite, there was outrage, but among another part, as always, there was this approach to Ukrainians as small, helpless children. We are the older brothers, we must educate them in the European way. They themselves do not know, after all, 𝐼𝐿. Well, he did it because he needs votes. Let us understand that. Let us not put ourselves forward with such a sense of superiority toward them. Let us give them time to mature toward self-purification. One day they will understand it. Or let us wait another 10, 20, 30, 100 years. Calmly, ladies and gentlemen, let us not treat them like children. They know perfectly well what they are doing. Now imagine this decision. 𝐼𝐿 is sitting there, and suddenly it occurs to him, I will name this Special Forces unit after the heroes of the UPA. He is not a child. There are advisors around him. He himself knows perfectly well, because he met with 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐜𝐡. He was with Duda in 𝐌𝐞𝐫𝐿𝐡. They laid flowers. He knows that the UPA affects Poles like a red rag to a bull, and rightly so. Therefore, surely one of his advisors, and he himself knew this perfectly well. We told him, Mr. President, do you realize, Mr. President, that there will be such a row with the Poles? And he knew perfectly well, and yet he made that decision. Listen, let's not treat him like a child. He knew perfectly well what he was doing. Why? Because, ladies and gentlemen, he decided that he could do it. And the Poles would talk, get outraged, take away his order, which he probably does not even remember receiving, and then anyway, within the paradigm that Ukraine is fighting Russia, they will do everything they will forget in the name of love between nations, 𝐼𝐿, all those extraordinary romantic ideas, and they will be allowed to do anything. And in my opinion, the time has come, indeed the highest time, for perhaps our political elites to wake up and understand that they are simply testing us, in the sense that if we do this and there is no adequate reaction, a symmetrical one, then they will know that they can do anything, and they will still get everything from us. I refer you to the books of 𝐌𝐸𝐴, who describes how Polish romantics, at all those conferences between Poland and Ukraine, came up against those hard, cunning post-Soviet operators who simply outplayed them in every field. They gave all the tanks. What else do you want? Here you go. And then President Andrzej Duda believed that they would be grateful. And at the end of the war, because of that gratitude, they would repay us. Unfortunately, that is not how it works. Gratitude is not in politics any kind of currency. And now what should be done? A lever must be found. In politics, a lever must be found. I am not going to suggest one, because our politicians should know that themselves. For example, we have 1 million-strong Ukrainian diaspora in Poland. That is a lever. We have a veto on the possible admission of Ukraine to the European Union. That is a lever. We have a number of possibilities. We have the port in Gdansk, through which grain passes. Therefore, let us find a lever, and we should finally play this masculine game that the Ukrainians are proposing to us, because we cannot make fools of ourselves. And therefore, this is the conclusion of our meeting today. This is one of the few cases in which realism, meaning that we must fight for our hard, sovereign position with Ukraine, which in certain matters is our ally in matters anti-Russian, and in the fight or in holding Russia back, and in other matters a rival. And here we must play realpolitik clearly and firmly, realpolitik, but on the other hand, defend the imponderables, because, ladies and gentlemen, we owe it to those people whose bones today lie scattered across all of Volhynia and all of eastern Galicia, without a dignified burial, because, as you know, the Ukrainians still do not agree to exhumations. So the grace period is over, and finally we will start playing this game on the terms on which the Ukrainians are playing it. Thank you very much.